This is panel 2.1, addressing barriers to entry for clinical professionals. So we know you're all in the right place. Just a reminder, the QR codes are on these posters. So if you want to submit any questions to the panel, they will go directly to our moderator's iPad there, and she'll see the questions. We're not going to do big explanations of any of the impressive bios of all of our panels, so I'm going to actually just turn it over to Emma Cardelli, who is our moderator today, who we heard from this morning as well.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you all so much for being here with us today. We really are hoping to have this be as interactive as possible and be a conversation, ensure that we're leaving time for the conversation. So I'm hoping we hear from all of you, and if the QR code system doesn't work, just shout out your questions and we'll go from there. So the reason we put together this panel really is because, quite frankly, for me as a clinical psychologist, it has been hard to find other clinical professionals who want to step into this space. And that's really understandable. I will say in my doctoral training, I learned two things when it came to working with clients who had potential for violence, right? The two things I learned was when to call somebody else, which usually was call the police. And then I also learned I should not have my clients sit in front of the door so that if I need to rapidly get out of the room, I have an exit and I can run away. When that's what I was taught as a clinical psychologist, right, I find that deeply troubling. It means I'm really not learning anything through my doctoral training about truly learning how to sit with somebody, respond to the needs of somebody who has the potential to commit a violent act or has committed a violent act, and then I'm not being trained to sit with that pain and emotional suffering that can often underlie someone's potential for violence, right? So we put together this panel, which really seeks to address barriers to entry to encourage participation from practitioners in this space and also leverage kind of the core competencies and ethics of our respective fields to create a framework for clinical practice in this space. And the people you see here are doing incredible work already. So I want to make sure I allot time to let them share what they're doing in this space and what they see as the key barriers and solutions around issues to entry. Haida.
Thank you. So we have each, I think, 3 to 4 minutes to describe something that would take hours. So what I'll do is actually serve you 4 small petit fours, and then we can share at some other moment the depth of issues that need to be discussed. For me, when we think both at a structuring level in terms of addressing barriers, to my point of view, there are 4 very significant barriers that both at policy, at organizations, and at education levels have to be addressed at the same time if we want to achieve a rapid answer. And the first barrier for me is the historical barrier. Historically speaking, the clinical practice or the mental health sector was not so much involved in issues related to national security. And when it was, it often violated the most basic principle of health, mental health practice, which is first, do no harm. So in history, we have examples where psychiatry and psychology have been misused to actually torture people, abuse human rights. Guantanamo is, I think, one of the clearest examples in that sphere. And so I think there are historical issues where we need to reestablish the function of clinical practice as a key partner in improving security and in protecting it from being misused by errors of work or malintended, I'd say, individuals or structures. The second barrier is the systemic barrier. And the systemic barrier actually is connected to the historical barrier the historical barrier of lack of trust between traditionally, let's say, the security sector, because extremism, terrorism is a security issue, but increasingly becoming also a public health issue. But there is historical mistrust between those institutions. And so the systemic barrier is the fact that everybody speaks about multi-stakeholderism, but nobody knows exactly how it works. Mm-hmm. And so we all say that we want to work together, but actually we don't really work together. Mm-hmm. I can give you a simple example. When we refer our clients to the other services, let's say housing or education, they are rejected 10 minutes after saying, but this is horrible what these people are saying. Yes, of course, that's part of their discourse. This is why they can't access a house. This is why they're failing in their education or in their projects. So we do not collaborate together. We do not know how to collaborate together. And for some reason, our organizations have very short collaboration memories. So that's another thing that has to be addressed in terms of barrier. There are the professional barriers. My only training and my best training in working with extremism was the fact that I myself have gone through 18 years of civil war. In none of my college, university career have I learned how to work as a clinical psychologist in violence situation. Gender-based violence has informed me a lot in working in the extremism field. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that it has informed me is that we still silo violence issues, whereas they're not siloed. Extremism cannot be siloed from gender-based violence. It cannot be siloed from, racist violence. And so there are significant professional barriers to the training of professionals, but also even to the theoretical understanding of how we approach the phenomenon from a conceptual framework, but also from an on-ground intervention framework. And finally, the individual barriers. Human working with another human. And the individual barriers are fear, they are anxiety, they are burnout, and they are stigma. Mm-hmm. Huge stigma for our clients who are on an extremist path, but also huge stigma for the practitioners who are trying to help those clients and the communities. So there are significant individual barriers that require that team leads develop a capacity of taking care of their own practitioners. I will end in saying, in my team, in a maybe 1 year period, 3 of our practitioners left because they just couldn't take it anymore. Mm-hmm. And so if a practitioner cannot take care of her or himself, it becomes very difficult for him or her to take care of the others. Mm-hmm. So I hope I haven't
You're perfect.
Overcome my time.
Miriam.
Yes, so my name is Miriam. I work with Parents for Peace with Pardeep, and I am a first responder. So what I was thinking is maybe to walk you to how Parents for Peace have worked and launched the helpline. In 2016, Parents for Peace was founded by family members whose loved one fell into extremism, and we were startled by what was going on, what was happening. So after interviewing many family members across the United States and Canada, and actually also in Europe, we realized that actually family members didn't have any service and a place to turn for help. And so we modeled the helpline after the suicide hotline, actually thanks to Rajiv Ramchand. He's not here from RAND Corporation, but he was helpful at the early stage of this, putting together the helpline. And in 2017, we launched on beta phase our helpline because what we realized is that when there is no services to family members, the outcome is devastating. It's either their loved one end up dead, many of them died overseas, or they are in prison for the rest of their life, but it's devastating the heart of the families. So it was very clear that we cannot let family members deal with this problem on their own. And so as we launched the helpline, we have learned tons since 2017, and so we start helping with our helpline is confidential and free to service as many people as possible. So just to walk you about how we work, so the work as a first responders have 5 phases, and again, before we call ourselves experts, the helpline was the teacher, the family members that, their loved one were groomed one family at a time, one kid at a time, are the one who helped put together this helpline. So from their insight, family's insight, and from the formers' insights, we had like a wealth of information and we were able to provide help. So the first phase is the intake. We try to get as much information as we can, and also to educate family members, because when they call us, they are incredibly in distress, they are very upset, and sometimes they make the situation worse. We've seen that actually in school system. Instead of helping, they end up making the situation worse and sometimes pushing young people into a supremacy platform. So the toolbox that we offer is really about what to do, what to not do, how to communicate with their loved one, how to build bonds with them, so to kind of get their kids back. What we often say to the family members, it's like a competition. We are competing, your family and Parents for Peace is competing with the supremacists that they are grooming your kids. And so, of course, our work would not be complete if we would not be working as a team with former supremacists, and we work cross ideology. And of course, that takes many follow-up in order to help families. Think of it as someone that is dealing with opioid. It takes a long journey to get them out from hate. Just the same. One of the reasons why we call it extremism is a drug of choice. So this stage of the educational space is very important, because when family members don't understand what's the problem, when schools don't understand what is extremism, and when clinicians don't really understand or have a misperception of what to do, is very complicated to have like a whole society, to be part of the solution. So, of course, extremism have been parts, of the law enforcement and criminal justice, and that's one of the reasons why people have stayed away from it. But speaking to the law enforcement, they told us, look, we're not social workers, we don't really get it. Our job is to arrest people, and at the end of the day, what we realize is that there is tons of missed opportunity when it's at an early stage. I mean, there is so much we can do before it becomes criminal. So, so when actually in reality, and I really would love to clinicians, but not only clinicians, actually everybody, like teachers, nurses, guidance counselors, pretty much all the eyeballs that are with our kids, that spend the most time with our kids, really need to be educated and to understand that the radicalization is really about unaddressed grievances, whether it's perceived grievances or real one. An identity plus an identity crisis, and also the groomers that find opportunism to really go recruit these vulnerable kids, is an equal successful radicalization. Each time we have family members that are isolated by shame and fear, and not to know what to do, and the kids are being isolated by groomers, it's a successful radicalization, and we need to really think about it as a whole society. And to end this presentation, I hope I didn't do over 3 minutes. I'm sorry, but so it's Parents for Peace really was able to collect a wealth of information, but we've been working isolated, and I'm so really glad that we were able to kind of reach out to Sarah from Life After Hate and start talking together, and with Haida, so we can really bring our heads together. This is actually how we find out that, oh, you too have problems with clinicians, and there's no many people that help with this problem. So this panel is really excellent for that. And And so we just found out that we got the DHS grant, so hooray, So now we're going to be able to bring all the information and the wealth of knowledge that we have to put it into intervention that we can really replicate, because that's the goal. And I just want to end to say that we are not going to be able to have a large impact on this problem if we don't have like a whole society, intervention. And what I'm saying is we always thought that clinicians should be their job because they understand issues and grievances. But really, teachers, everybody that are in the school system, we all need to be educated so we can prevent. Thank you.
Thank you. Pardeep Kalika with Parents for Peace. When we were having this initial conversation, when we were all prepping, I think we went on for about an hour some, and we discussed best practices. And as we discussed, there was just a lot of understanding. So I just want to get a feel of the room. How many of you are practitioners? Okay. How many in law enforcement? And then maybe some other people who touch other people's lives? Okay. So that's good to know. And I mean, again, like when we think about this whole society approach, right, we need to be able to build these webs of mutuality, as we discussed, and really make sure that we are supporting one another, watching out for one another, whether that's the vicarious trauma that we pick up from our clients because this is very intense work, whether it's something that we've been through when we're formers and it's bringing up something in us that makes us see our past self and that part of ourselves that we feel shame or hate or whatever kind of feeling around, and be sensitive to that. As a society, we kind of have sort of a rejectionist society that would rather reject this problem rather than understand the problem and try to be informed and see what can we do about it. We have systems, as you pointed out. So I mean, there's so many things, and I'm glad that we get to talk about the problems, because sometimes, I mean, you can't dismiss those problems. But one of the issues that even I stay up at night, you stay up at night, other people stay up at night, is the duty to warn, right? The duty to protect. And for each one of us, when we talk about that oath that we take, right, whether we're peer support, psychologists, PsyDs, PhDs, LPCs, whatever acronym you want to put on this, right, we have a duty to protect not only our client, but society, right? And this was made famous with the Tarsoff and Regents decision, 1974. Within that particular case, what happened and I'm just going to be review for everybody else that's in the practitioner field, but Prosenjit Prater was going out with Tatiana Tarsoff. They broke up, and he continued to kind of still stalk her. He went to go get help at his university, and when he did, he told his psychologist at the time that I planned to kill her. And his psychologist, had him institutionalized. Well, the institutionalization lasted so long, and he was let out. And then as the investigation kind of went forward, her supervisor, right, the psychologist supervisor said, okay, we have confidentiality, because that was the main focus at that time. We need to protect our clients. And yes, because we also need that relationship, right? So we want to build that trusting relationship. What happened was he ended up murdering her. And when he murdered her, the parents never knew about it. She never knew about it. They didn't reveal that. And so the person that was being hunted down, and the way that this case was so, sinister, that he ended up befriending her brother without them knowing that he had this whole plan concocted. And so that decision set the precedent on duty to warn. In 2012, that changed a little bit from I encourage you to warn if you know, I encourage you to warn if you know somebody's an imminent threat, to after the Newtown shooting and after other shootings, it became, you have to do it. It's, and I don't know if that made it harder. I don't know if that made it better, but that's where we are right now, is that practitioners have this, and you're going to wrestle with clients who are going to come in, and all of the other difficulties within the mental health field of not enough mental health clinicians, not enough in this field, not enough, and you're dealing with now those that have high rates of borderline traits, suicidal, homicidal ideation, and alcoholism, substance abuse, compounded. And you're gonna, like, if you're working at a practice, who wants to be that clinician that takes that case? Yes, I got a person who is espousing this ideology, borderline traits, is violent, has a history, and is using drugs. Right? I'd rather have the mom who's going through a tough time with her husband. Right? So that's one of the difficulties that I want to lay out, is that we're going to have high rates of burnout. You're going to want people. There's not going to be a lot of people who want to apply for those types of jobs. And so it takes a lot of courage, but then it takes a whole of society approach, not just to do the work, but to support those that are doing the work. So I'm going to stop there and then we can.
I appreciate the panelists before me because each one of them has brought up something really important. And my name is Sarah. I'm a clinical psychologist and I work with Life After Hate. And I want to speak to what it would be like and what the barriers we're seeing to engaging clinicians to work with our clients. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the primary issues we're finding is that clinicians have a legal and an ethical obligation to work with populations for which they have competency, that they are trained and they understand, they've had supervised practice to work with these populations. And what we find is probably the most competent providers are the ones who are recognizing, I don't have the experience to do this. I don't have the training to do this. And I see some clinicians clearly in the audience nodding their head. And what we want and what we need is to show clinicians that, first of all, this population we're working with is actually very much like every other population you work with. They have some of the same presenting problems with trauma, depression, anxiety, emotion and behavior dysregulation, things that we have empirically supported treatments for. They also have this additional risk of being involved in ideological violence or potentially being involved in ideological violence. And so it's both educating and training clinicians to see what they already know, the competencies they already have, and adding the competencies that they need to work with this population. And the next competency would be assessing and managing complex risk. There's no way around it that a population that's engaged in violent extremism does represent risk. And it isn't just risk for mass violence, it's risk for street violence, which is far more common among the violent far right. It's a risk for domestic violence and the nuanced and sensitive handling of domestic violence cases to ensure that we're not putting people at risk is essential. And we also are finding, after a case review of over 2 years of client data, that 42% of what we call exiting individuals, these are people who are actively involved in violent extremism or in the early stages of exit, nearly 50%, 42% reported suicidal ideation at intake. So this is a complex series of risks that we need to be able to assess and manage in working with this population. And along with that risk and assessment of risk and management of risk is the psychological burden of doing this work. And some of the other panelists have spoken to this, but I will say that every day I wake up and recognize that no matter how much I do as a provider, no matter how many risk assessments and risk mitigation strategies we use, no matter what we do, we may not be able to prevent acts of violence. And that is an incredible burden to bear as the mental health provider who goes into this field wanting to help others, wanting to take care of their clients, and now also wanting to take care of society, having this responsibility to society. Of course, there is also the issue of sitting with people espousing dehumanizing ideologies and justifying violence. It takes an incredible level of composure to sit and listen to someone espouse these beliefs. And that is also a psychological burden. And then, as has been discussed, there is also the real risk to safety. So thinking about the private practice clinician inviting someone like this into their office and not knowing anything more than don't block the door. And so, which was the same training that I received in 5 years of graduate education, multiple years of postgraduate education. That was it. So I had to go seek out my own training in multiple places for risk and threat assessment, for managing complex risk, for treating emotion and behavior dysregulation, and so on. So the good news, after all of these burdens we describe and barriers, I come with good news. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. We need to work within the professional standards that we already have. We need to engage independently licensed clinicians in all 50 states. And we need to engage the most competent clinicians. We need to provide education, training, supervised practice experience. And it doesn't just start with the clinicians that are already practicing. It needs to begin in graduate programs, in in social work graduate programs, in psychology graduate programs, so that clinicians begin to see this as just another one of the maladaptive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that we know how to engage with, and also understand some of the specialized nuances of this population. We also need to provide that continuing education, and along with that, we need consultation groups and networks of providers who can consult with each other. So as we engage those licensed providers in all 50 states, those people have someone to reach out to. There could be monthly meetings where people get together to talk about practice issues, but also the burdens of working with this population, and share that burden, because we should all be working in teams to combat violence, just as everyone here has said and as has been said all morning. So I will cede the floor to Barry.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, panel members. It's an esteemed group here, and I find myself very privileged to be part of this. I'm an outlier. I've always been. In my family, I always went the different direction. So I'm going to go in a little different direction now. Mark earlier this morning talked about investment for the future. And I'm going to approach this from that perspective. I'm the founder, president of Altruism in Medicine Institute. We're developing curriculum to help educate children from kindergarten all the way up to develop tool sets when they're frustrated, when they're getting angry, to rather than react angrily and maybe even with rage, to react in a way that's more healthy for them and for the people around them. Emotional hygiene is the name of one such toolkit. And essentially, emotional hygiene is learning to first recognize our harmful emotions, thoughts, attitudes. And second, once we've recognized them, to work with them to try to transform or flip them into their positive opposites. So what am I talking about? It's recognizing anger and learning methods to flip or transform it without suppressing into tolerance and patience. It's learning to recognize when we're jealous. When we're really obviously jealous, we know we're jealous. But often we're jealous and we don't notice it. But it contracts us. We don't feel well. So learning to recognize jealousy, learning methods to transform jealousy into its healthy opposite, which is appreciation or admiration. And thirdly, arrogance or pride, learning to recognize it and learning methods to transform it into humility, its healthy opposite. And fourthly, the opposite of arrogance, when we're putting ourselves down. We do that a lot. And often it's under the radar. So learning through using mindfulness techniques, which basically means learning to observe your mind. So one part of the mind is a little bit like spying or observing what's happening in the mind, in the heart and the mind, in the present moment. And when you notice arrogance, you tell yourself, I think I flipped into arrogance, so I'm going to use those methods that I learned to transform it into a healthy opposite of humility. When we're putting ourselves down, we're going to be using the tool of mindfulness. We're going to recognize, I'm putting myself down again. There's that thought or those words that are coming out that are self-deprecating. And I'm going to actually flip this to what we call healthy self-confidence. Healthy self-confidence is neither putting myself down nor putting the other person down, which is arrogance, right? So neither arrogance or self-doubt, feeling inferior, imposter syndrome. Okay. So that's kind of what we deal with quite a bit. And what I'd like to do now is a very short contemplative meditation, big words. We're just going to sit quietly. And what I'm going to ask you to do is sit with your spine straight so the energies can flow unimpededly in your body, in your subtle body. And I'd like you to remember, you can close your eyes for this. I'd like you to remember the last time you got angry. And try to focus on what happened just before you got really angry. So we call the pre-anger stuff. When you were getting irritated, when you were frustrated, when you had tension in your body. You might have been shaking a little bit. Your heart might have been pounding. You might have been breathing fast. Try to remember those early signs of anger. And then once you can tap into that, I'm going to give you a method so that you can imagine that those early signs are with you now, early signs of anger, and that you're going to apply a method, which I'll tell you in a moment, and you're going to transform those early signs of anger into their healthy opposite of tolerance. The method is this. You imagine that your pre-anger stuff, your irritation, your tremulousness, tension in the body, etc., becomes a cloud. And the cloud is going to drift across the sky, completely dissipate, completely dissolve, along with your pre-anger. And notice we're not suppressing. And by doing this again and again and again, we'll actually reduce the frequency and intensity of our anger. So please sit quietly. Imagine the last time you were feeling angry. It might be now. And try to remember the precursors. What were the feelings, the sensations in your body just before you got really angry? Please focus on that for just a few moments. Fear is often a part of that. Anxiety. And now please imagine that pre-anger stuff becomes a cloud. And you imagine that it drifts across the sky. And as it does, it starts to get smaller and smaller and completely dissolves along with your pre-anger. And imagine that you've been liberated from that anger to be. And feel lighter, feel more joyous, feel the heart more open. I'd like to give you a second method. You can imagine that pre-anger stuff becomes a crystal ball that you kind of palm in your hand, like if you have big hands you would with a basketball. And you drop the crystal ball onto a stone floor, and it shatters into 1,000 pieces along with your pre-anger, thereby reducing the likelihood of you actually becoming angry and thereby becoming tolerant. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you all so much. I'm still in the process a bit of returning to the room after that, Mary. Thank you. And I will say from the anger standpoint, I think what you're speaking to is really important for clinicians to be reflecting on in the moment as well. I know myself as a clinical psychologist working in this space, there are times where I am working to support somebody else and have my own anger that comes up as a result of what is being said to me. And so there's ways in which I really do need to be chronically observing triggers to my own anger and doing something with that anger that's ultimately going to be helpful, not harmful, ideally, to this client. So I really appreciate you taking us through that. Let's see, we have some questions that have come through. I also have 1,000,002 questions I could ask you all. I'm going to start with the Q&A that's come through, though. Let's start with, we got a question. I think the whole panel actually can speak to this. I'm not going to aim this at any one of you, but it says here, only 30 to 40% of mental health professionals can accurately describe their duty to warn or protect responsibilities, or describe permissible disclosures under HIPAA. What are your recommendations for countering this deficiency to promote better crisis response and critical information sharing? Who wants to? I see Sarah's hand going up first.
May I jump on this?
Yeah.
So one of the challenges working nationwide as a program is that we are aware that actually what Pardeep is describing is California law for duty to warn and duty to protect. But each state has a different set of laws and regulations. There is a map that the Prevention Practitioners Network has actually disseminated that shows the duty to warn and duty to protect in each state. And there are wild discrepancies between the states. It's incredible to see it. So for example, in the state of Oregon, as a licensed provider, I have discretion of whether I warn or report to law enforcement. Now, one of the recommendations I would have is that any kind of training program talks about this, that each state has different standards. If you're having a nationwide program, you need to talk about the fact that you need to go check these, and they are readily available on your licensing board websites and in your statutes that you should know. Typically, you have to learn them before you get your license in a state. The other piece is that this can be addressed in your informed consent. So for example, in our informed consent in Life After Hate, where we do not provide mental health services, but we have social workers providing case management, our informed consent says these are the conditions under which we will report. We are mandated reporters, so it is duty to warn, it is duty to protect, and we will, if you tell us you're going to commit an act of violence, we are going to take steps to prevent that act of violence from occurring. But also, we report child abuse, and we also manage domestic violence risk. And so there are multiple forms of risk and mandated reporting that are nuanced for each state. So it needs to be part of the education, it needs to be part of the training and the continuing education as well.
And just really quickly,
Yeah,
I think it's good to put all of that up front and let the client know, develop a relationship. Sometimes we get around that of like having a trusting enough relationship to make sure that they know about the ways that they can mitigate some of that, like parents can mitigate some of the threat. There is something called a counseling compact that is in the works right now. And I think next year, 2023, there's about 21 states that are part of it right now or in the process of it that will let LPCs have jurisdiction in different areas.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's only the peer support specialist can have nationwide jurisdiction. And LPCs are getting it where they can, and then different fields will have to apply for different things. But that's something that's in the works right now because telehealth and all these other things are coming out, and I think some of the challenges that we're facing in this particular field, they want to be able to do that.
Ah, that's very good to know.
Yeah.
Very good to know.
There's one occurring in psychology for licensed psychologists, so I'm familiar with that.
Speaking to the Tarasov case, I know one of the tricky things about that particular case is when you think of when concerns were reported, right, when something was actually reported versus when this woman was murdered. It was what, 65, 67 days, thereabout? And I know what often comes up as a provider is this piece of, the imminency of the danger, right? When the danger is imminent, right, I need to report. And I want to contextualize that because if we think usually the word imminent is not used to describe a threat, let's say, that would happen 67 days after something was reported. And I just wanted to hold that in the space with you all and hear your thoughts as practitioners. How do we respond to imminent threats when imminent could be 3 months after something's articulated?
I think one of the issues comes from the way we train practitioners on what imminent threat is, what threat is, and what risk is. And there tends to be a confusion between those three aspects. There is also another confusion that is I think that I find less with practitioners who have had experience with highly suicidal patients, because we learn from the sad occurrences, is the fact that risk, sometimes practitioners tend to think of risk as moments, like frozen in space in a person's trajectory, whereas risk is like waves in the sea. It's always there, and it fluctuates at different moments. And one of the ways that we can address it is for practitioners to work with their clients at risk on the baseline. We all have baselines where things are going well, and we all have situations that go above that baseline with specific triggers, and understanding those triggers can help us. So there is an issue of understanding of including risk assessment as a continuous process.
Yes.
That does not mean administering the risk, whatever questionnaire or instrument. We have to be very careful with that, because our clients get to understand where we're heading in terms of using those tools. But really to have a more flexible understanding, a more continuous understanding of risk. And I think one other very important issue in practitioners from the other sectors, so our colleagues who are less used to working with clients who have higher risk for suicide or for homicide, is that they know how to assess risk.
Yep.
But they don't know how to locate where the risk is. So if I may give an example of a psychotic client whose delirium is evolving around violent extremism. So the psychiatrist who may be evaluating the client will focus on stabilizing the psychotic features, the disconnect with reality, but will think in general, not in general, I don't want to generalize, this is a specific case situation, that the radicalized ideological component is actually a component of the delirium. So it stays encapsulated within that psychotic feature, which means that it drives the psychiatrist away from the zone where the risk is. So I may not perceive my client as a risk for his daughter or his wife, and it appears to me that he's not at risk. And I might completely forget that the risk is actually shifting to another target that I'm not used to perceiving because of my understanding of the situation, but also, unfortunately, because of who I am as a practitioner, my privileges, my biases, my angles that I don't see. And so there is this whole issue of understanding risk as continuous, but understanding that the threat may not be where we think it is, particularly in the field where human distress and despair mixes with violence.
Yes.
So that's another thing we have to work on.
Let me
Yes,
chime in as because at Parents for Peace, we really are, our interventions are like the non-clinical interventionists. And, when family call us, for instance, speaking of threat assessment and say, so that happened not too long ago, for instance, I found under my son's bed 12 rifles and also documents that were very concerning. By the way, he's not taking his medication and he's using drugs. So, and I understand what all of you are doing, that's one of the reasons why the whole society intervention is important. So clinical psychology should not be the only one who are doing this. I think teachers and the people that spend the most time with the kids really should have like a protocol, because our first, the top priority is to be responsible, because we don't want anybody, people that get harmed from someone that has 12 rifles under their bed. So what have been successful for us, as non-clinical interventionists, is to work with the family. And it's very hard because families don't call the cops on their kids. So we understand that, and that's one of the reasons. Actually, Pardeep was talking earlier to another roundtable about how we need to all work together, the law enforcement and clinicians and families and the whole society approach, where actually how can we all be responsible together to prevent harm. And what that means here is having conversation with family members on saying, look, I know that you don't want to call the cops on your kid, but you don't want to be in the first page of the newspaper tomorrow because there's going to be a massacre. So working with them together, actually the families end up reaching out to the law enforcement for help. And that had been very impactful. And so his Parents for Peace, the families, the law enforcement, and we have like a larger society intervention. So like Sarah was saying, not one group have to carry the burden. I really want to encourage strongly that the school steps in and carry the burden as well.
Yes, yes. To that point, I think, right, everybody agrees the response to this problem really requires whole of society approaches. And to something important that Haida was talking about before too is that the systems we often operate in are not naturally built for collaboration. And so I wanted to ask you all as panelists, we all know collaboration is critical. And can we generate some solutions for the things we all know get in the way of us being able to collaborate on these very complicated cases? So,
would delinquent behavior be allowed?
Delinquency.
So why am I saying that jokingly is because systems are built to protect their barriers. And it's very hard to go through those barriers with like those big protocols. And what I find, in my opinion, very humbly, what I find was the key factor for our strong, sustained collaboration with police, with RCMP, so from Canada, but also with schools, with housing services, with mental health, with universities, was capitalizing on relationships, not on system functioning. And I'm saying that because when we look at a specific case that goes through all the actors, because we have cases that are involved with police, involved with housing, involved with education, that need some form of psychological support. And one of the main issue is information sharing, right? That's one of the biggest challenge.
Yeah.
And information sharing does not have the same criteria depending on where you work. So if you're a police, you all know there's some information you can share, some others you can't. Mental health professionals, huge barrier for information sharing. So developing bonds, trust, relationships between real people working in those machine systems is the key. Without, I'm not saying that without kind of betraying the codes of ethics that we have for information sharing, we can find ways like anonymous case discussions, like tabletop exercise after, like certain ways of communication. But this may seem like a ridiculous answer I'm giving, and it's not like this huge answer about how do you transform systems into creating, instilling collaborative structures into systems. This will take billions of dollars and years, and somebody comes and does it and then goes to retirement, and it all goes down with them. It's about building sustained trust relationships between us, people working in this field, and carrying those trust relationships across.
I think, the other thing that you want to do, like kind of you want to case consult all the time. You don't want to do this by yourself. You want to get Sarah, you want to get somebody else. You want to be like, okay, am I seeing what I think I'm seeing? Is this what it's about? And exactly, yes. Prevention is going to happen at the speed of relationships, for sure. And I think that the work that you all do with yourselves, making sure you're taking care of yourselves as you do this work, right? It's a very real thing. So make sure you guys are doing that.
Please, Barry. Yeah.
Yes, I think one of the reasons we silo is language and culture.
Uh-huh.
And I'm using culture in terms of our organizational culture. Because every organization has its own culture, what's safe, what's not safe,
Yep.
has its own language, how we talk about things, and has its own meaning. So we may use similar words, but the way we use the term has different meaning.
Totally.
And so when we try to then collaborate, we're not aware often of the other culture. We're not aware that the same words can have different meaning. And we're not aware that different words are being used in each culture. So that really gets back to what Gaia was talking about. We have to get to meet people face to face, get to know them, and develop some kind of trust, some kind of friendship maybe, at least collegial kind of relationship. So we can break down the silos of language and culture.
And to have humility around what we are not aware of, to make sure we're approaching our relationship building from the standpoint of humility. Well, I know this is about to ding on us, and we're almost out of time. I did want to turn it, over to you all in the audience. Does anybody have a question they're burning to ask of our esteemed panelists here? Yes, please.
So, Heidi was talking about the challenges and the stigmas with mental health professionals, and some of the challenges they face on doing the work, burnout, and how much of that do you think comes from pre-clinician training, right? So when you deal with somebody who's blatantly a white supremacist, and they're in front of you, and you might be a person of color or ethnicity, and that trigger, like, is there a difference between the way that you treat somebody with, like, borderline manic and depression versus how you would treat somebody with ideological, right? Like, when you take the ideological and you're comfortable away, it's the same process.
Yeah.
So people are like, oh, well, like, you got to get different training. Really, you don't. You have everything you need. It's just the uncomfortable stuff of, like, I don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
So as the oath of do no harm, by clinicians avoiding the responsibility of their seat at the table and leaving it open, would that not inherently be doing more harm? And would that not violate their code of ethics?
So that's a good question, and I think I'm going to try to answer it shortly. I think one part of the problem comes from the pre-training. So how prepared, how trained are you generally to tackle stories, discourses that may traumatize you? Okay, so that's generally the pre-training. So there's definitely an issue in the pre-training. There is another issue, and Barry, you pointed it out so well. The other issue is that clinicians, people who want help, who what a great Freudian.
I know, I was going to say that. It's a good Freudian slip.
Clinicians who help tend to situate themselves in the role of good people who are there to help others. And a big part of their identity, even the narcissistic part of the identities, are built around this role. And oftentimes when they are confronted with individuals who express deep resentment and hate for either their skin color, their religion, who tells them that they're not doing a good job, that they're bad at everything they do, that because of them they want to commit suicide or kill whomever they want to kill, it's very ego-dystonic as a discourse. And it provokes a lot of fear, anxiety, anger, stomach aches that often are not dealt with. Practitioners, and I don't use the word clinicians, I use practitioners because for me it's not psychologists and social workers only. So practitioners are in a system, I don't know about the US, but in Canada, in a system where we're asking them to do more with less and less time. They have rarely time to sit back and reflect on those. And they also feel threatened in their identity. So if you are a black, non-binary woman, and sitting in front of a white 25-year-old incel man and hearing, all those bad, horrific things that can be said, you are constantly being attacked in your identity. And identity is so, it's the thing that shapes us. It's core, It's like identity makes like a passionate reaction, it's so strong. And so what happens is that both the clinician and the client fall into the trap of giving the ideology more and more importance and more space, which is the wrong way to go. And they forget that they're actually two humans talking to each other. And there is one thing that is common in all of us humans. We all suffer. And this is where we all can connect. But unfortunately, we haven't learned how to help ourselves and our clients reduce the, in French we say emprise.
Yeah, or even the grievance we haven't.
Reduce the power that the ideology has on the lives of our clients and on our own lives in the situation when we see them. And this is not pre-training. This is during work. This is training during practice. This is something you learn and you think about and you reflect in supervision during practice. And it's essential because practitioner, you are so closely connected to your client. You are the one who can help then build bridges with law enforcement, with housing, with school, with all the other individuals that have lost track of the humanity of their clients because their clients is dehumanizing the others. So I don't know if it kind of answered your question. And yes, then it means unintentionally we may be falling short of our ethical,
I really appreciate that, because you touch really a core issue, because not even for practitioners, I would say in the field of extremism, many of us that call ourselves expert and and big names in that field haven't dealt with our own issues.
Gosh, no.
And we end up kind of like, instead of helping, many of us that are experts sound actually angry. We seem to be helping, but actually we haven't really dealt with our own underlying issue, and we end up in that field kind of being expert, talking about this issue, but we haven't dialed our stuff. And I really like what Barry was doing. The exercise, I appreciate the exercise you get us to do, and that you're working with small children, because attending to the anger, exactly, the inner anger, especially among boys, very early, so we don't become all this angry adult, and sometimes we become a white supremacist, but sometimes we're going to be an expert in extremism and use it in a way of dealing with this issue. So I really appreciate that. I think we would all be on our time.
That's okay.
I know we have to wrap up, but I know we have to wrap up, but I want to thank you all so much, you guys in particular, for a beautiful conversation. I could keep going for hours. And thank you all for being here with us. If anybody wants to keep having sidebar conversations about any of these things over the next few days, please find us.
Don't hesitate.
We'd love to have them. Okay?
And we like to talk.